Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar on planning for resilience and the challenges that this may face. We are Lucy and Rosie, we are from the Pinnacle Learning Trust and we are EdTech demonstrators. Rosie is from Oldham Sixth Form College. At the minute at the Sixth Form College they are doing a mixture of live lessons and also face-to-face teaching. Myself, I'm a French teacher at Hathershaw College, which is a secondary school, and we are doing face-to-face teaching at the moment, and when students are remote learning we are using Google Classroom, a mixture of assignments and also pre-recorded lessons. So the aim of this webinar today, like I said, is looking at resilience. It's quite evidence-based, but we'd also like to provide you with some practical ideas that you are able to take away and implement in your classroom. I'm going to introduce Rosie now, who will take over, and she's going to talk to you about metacognition.
Okay, so we're talking about resilience. This is always important with students and in the educational setting. It's increasingly important with what's going on at the moment. So with the pandemic and such uncertain times in terms of whether kids are going to be in lesson, working from home, what's going on with exams. So it's increasingly important to make sure that these students are resilient. The emotional impact that the pandemic's having as well can cause, you know, some wobbles in resilience. And so we're hoping that we can look at some ways to encourage resilience in terms of learning for these students. So we're going to look at this through metacognition, which I'm going to cover today. And then Lucy will be talking about modelling and generative learning. So I'll start off by talking about metacognition. So what we mean by metacognition is the kind of idea that is learning to learn. So it's being aware of the processes of learning, thinking about your learning process or a student's learning process. So this refers to processes used to plan, monitor and assess one's understanding and performance. So it includes a sort of a critical awareness of thinking and learning. So just having a little think about why it's important. So I'm sure lots of schools doing CPD on metacognition. It's not sort of a new idea, but it's really, really important, especially in building resilience in young people. And we're hoping that we can kind of give you some ideas that relate specifically to maybe online resources or online resilience. So why it's important, so metacognition, so this is related to the Educational Endowment Foundation, so it's all kind of evidence-based. So cognition and self-regulation approaches, so they've consistently received sort of positive feedback in terms of the research that's gone into them. They've had high levels of impact, so it's really, you know, relevant stuff to be applying. There's kind of some statistics just having a look. So with pupils making on average 7 months additional progress, when actually using some metacognitive approaches. They tend to have more effective, be more effective when taught in collaborative groups. So learners are supporting each other and, you know, bouncing ideas off each other. And I know that can be particularly challenging due to COVID and due to distance learning, but I'm hoping we can kind of give you some ideas of how you might be able to do that. So potential impact, like I've said, is high, but it can be difficult to achieve in practice. So it's requiring pupils taking greater responsibility for their learning and developing their understanding of what is required to succeed. And again, that can be really difficult when students are distance learning at home, or as it is at Oldham. So we've got a week in and a week at home. So it's thinking about how can you encourage students to be independent, resilient learners. So I'm going to start off by thinking about thinking aloud. So one of the best ways that you can sort of encourage metacognition is through explaining what you're doing as you're doing it. So kind of making explicit what you would do implicitly. So as a teacher, making it visible what might be invisible to a learner. So it might seem common sense, certain things that we do for us because we've studied our subject for so long, but it could be about breaking it down and really explaining the step-by-step thought process that you're going through. So when the teacher's kind of modelling good practice. So it might be things like modelling, writing a paragraph for an essay, or, you know, answering a question, what thought process is going on there. Making mistakes is a good way to do it as well. So you might write a key term and then maybe think a better one's, a different one is better, and crossing it out, but kind of modelling that thought process, thinking about, I've got my point, what am I going to do next? I'm going to include a study. Which study might be relevant here? Would it be that one, or could I include a different one? And I'll move on to maybe some examples of how you might do that. The EEF suggests that it's important not to be too specific with what you're doing, so that it's leaving room for students to kind of reflect on their learning and reflect on what they might include. So it can sometimes inhibit pupils' reflection if it's too kind of specific. So sometimes making a bit of deliberate difficulty, so where students have to kind of fill in the gaps for themselves and monitor their learning with increasing independence. So some examples, if you've got access to visualizers, that can be a fantastic way to model. So modeling exam questions, even marking. So modeling how you might mark can be really useful for students to think about, kind of thinking about your thought process when you're looking at their work. What are you looking for and how is that useful for them? And that's a really useful way to do kind of online as well. So you can record videos or do it live. It depends what's going on at your school. Like I said, so you could do pre-recorded videos, could do screen sharing as we're doing now, you could be typing as you're kind of thinking out loud. You might be showing revision techniques and maybe decoding questions. So within sociology, it's a lot about decoding questions. What's it actually asking? So this is an example that I used of modelling the other day in one of my live lessons. Students have to remember quite a lot of studies in sociology, and there's lots of different things to remember in every different subject. So what I did for them, I wanted them to think of pictures that represented certain studies. So I showed them pictures that worked for me, but I explained to them clearly, this wouldn't work for you. If you don't think, if your brain doesn't make the same connections as mine does, I explained, my connections, but said, please don't just copy these, you need to think of your own. And that again is making them think, where is your brain going? What links is it making that will be useful for revision? So thinking hard. So teachers, it's important that as teachers that we're setting an appropriate level of challenge. So by challenging students, it makes sure that students are self-regulating, kind of developing metacognitive ideas, self-regulation, and it's converting into the long-term memory. So it's important to face difficulty. So as I've said, modelling, not just simply saying do this, do this, do this, but actually there needs to be some difficulty and some challenge there. If there's no difficulty, then it means students aren't developing strategies to overcome the difficulties. And so this idea can be sort of particularly of concern when students are distance learning. So if things are too easy, does that mean that they're switching off, they're not learning new strategies to cope with this challenge, and therefore they're not self-regulating, they're not becoming independent learners, and potentially is this knowledge not being transferred into their long-term memory because the tasks are too simple, too easy potentially. So they need to develop new and useful strategies, need to learn from their mistakes and reflect on the content that they're learning. So if there's no reflection, then it's, like I said, it's hard for that to convert into the long-term memory. So it can deepen the learning that is occurring. So the EEF offers some useful questions for pupils to ask that gauge the difficulty of the level that they're of the work that they're doing. So you can, give these questions to your students and get them to be self-reflecting, self-regulating, independently asking themselves these questions. So is the task too challenging for me? What can they do to, help themselves? What are the most difficult aspects of this task? How much time should I devote to this task? So if it is a tricky task, then, making sure that they ask themselves, is it okay that this is taking me half an hour? Is that a suitable amount of time? Are there easy bits I can get done? I won't go through all of these. So knowledge of self as well. These questions are particularly useful when it comes to online learning. So I know a lot of our students are saying it's really hard to stay focused, to self-motivate, and it's things that they need to learn to do, especially as it's going through the next stages of their kind of educational journey. So what can they do to keep themselves focused? So knowledge of strategies. So are my notes effective for understanding this task? If yes, excellent. If not, does something need to change there? Do I need help from the teacher? What strategies can I employ if I'm stuck? Is it asking the teacher, can I do something before I do that? What can I do to ensure I remember what I've learned? So it might be things for some learners, they really like that kind of picture connection. For others, it might be acronyms or whatever it might be, but thinking about that thought process again. Some examples of thinking hard. So student self-reflection on a lesson. So it might be things, so I know Lucy said we're teaching sort of lower school, so year 7, 8, there's lots of self-reflection. So what have I learned in this lesson? What did I find interesting, and what do I want to learn next lesson? We do similar things in sixth form as well. So 3 things, this is from a lesson from year 13. So 3 things that I've learned today I did not previously know. How easy did I find today's lesson on a scale of 1 to 10? That can be really useful as a teacher as well. So you can see, you can gauge, we can see if you're gauging it at the right kind of level. Did I push myself in today's lesson? Did I try to answer questions using my existing knowledge rather than relying on the booklet? What questions do I still have, and how am I going to find the answers? So again, putting some of that kind of onus on the student for them to kind of reflect and contribute to their learning and thinking about their learning process. So hard thinking questions as well, not making it easy, making students think of their own evaluation or criticism for certain studies is maybe how I would use hard thinking. And then for the students, obviously we don't want to get students into that, the maybe lower ability students into the panic zone. So scaffolding and hints can be really useful for those students. And actually differentiation can be really easy on online learning. It's actually easy, I think it can be easier than in the classroom. Students don't really see, who's getting which worksheet. Is it scaffolded? Do I have hints on mine? Do they not have hints on theirs? So it's hopefully trying to gauge that, a bit of differentiation on online tasks. And then again, in extension tasks, and this kind of links with something I'm going to talk about later on with motivation. So extension tasks, encouraging students to, maybe research something else, broaden their knowledge, add to their knowledge. So having said that, so really important that we're thinking hard, but also it's important to think efficiently. So kind of cheating the limitations of working memory. And I've said this a couple of times to my students today. So what knowledge can you use that we've already learned that you can apply here? How does the knowledge we've got apply to this new topic that we're coming on to? So it's kind of, so the EEF says it's kind of like cheating the limitations of working memory. So yes, pupils must be challenged, must struggle with new concepts if they're kind of, to attend to them actively and therefore transfer them into long-term memory. But if the work's too hard, they potentially might sort of hit that cognitive overload, trying to hold too much in that working memory. So the trick is making the work hard but achievable. The work must be beyond current capability, so something that they, don't currently know but can use prior knowledge to access, but is within their reach. So there must be a little bit of struggle, is the argument, but they must be able to overcome this with time, effort, and support. So this kind of comes from Sweller, the cognitive load theory. I'm not sure if people have heard of that, possibly. It's not kind of a new thing, but just thinking about what that means and how we can kind of apply that in this new context that we're kind of working in. So the first idea that Sweller talks about is this idea of schema. So this is the idea, I'll come to that in a sec actually. So, and secondly, avoiding cognitive overload with coping strategies. So when it comes to a schema, it's adapting and applying prior knowledge that we've got. So this is actually the example of schemas that I've used with health and social care students previously. So we have an idea of something. So in this circumstance, we have an idea of what a cow is. We know that it's a large animal with 4 legs and a tail. When we see something new, so potentially a horse, and this is the first time, we might apply that to a schema that we already have. So we already have a schema on cows, so we might apply that for the horse. And then what we need to do is kind of modify an existing schema, which we have for the cow, and create a new one for a horse. So when we're thinking of that in terms of learning, what knowledge do we already have on a topic that can then be kind of adapted for a new topic? So within sociology, we can think about, what have we learned in a previous topic, which we can then apply? Does it fit this new topic that we're looking at? So we can understand new topics within the context of what we already know. So the more pupils know and can draw from their long-term memory, the more meaningful new knowledge will become, and the more they'll be able to process and apply it. So where possible, making connections across the specification and relating knowledge to knowledge they already have. Where possible, maybe knowledge to outside of college or outside of this specific subject or school, sorry, rather than college. So again, making links. What experiences have they had? Can you relate their learning to that? And then avoiding cognitive overload with coping strategies. So it's important that there's not too much demand on the working memory, which would cause this, what Sweller calls cognitive overload. So we need to be able to teach students coping strategies, So it might be things like using mind maps, taking more effective notes, thinking aloud to work through problems. So quite often students can say, no, don't understand it. And it's about maybe breaking it down with them, getting them to do as you've done, talk through the process, break it down bit by bit. And then again, so things like, breaking tasks down into smaller steps, as I've said. So we can support this lots of different strategies. So you might use things like planning templates. So I use these a lot within sociology, and it's really easy to do online as well. So previously, where I would have used essay plans, and I would have broken them down into what I want in each paragraph, and gradually reduced how much I'm including there. That's really easy to do online. So with Google Docs, a copy for each student, and you can see how they're working on it. Or again, it can be nice to create some group work and students can work on essay templates or planning templates together. It might be things like learning revision strategies, teacher modelling, worked examples, breaking tasks down, and then, dealing with one bit at a time rather than it seeming like this massive daunting task that students need to complete. Okay, so I'll move on to talking about thinking positively. So research suggests that an important factor in sort of effective use of metacognitive strategies is the ability to delay gratification. So you don't see that immediate effect. You don't employ a strategy and then immediately see the satisfaction. So it's that gratification is delayed or deferred. So in other words, pupils are better able to delay rewards in favour of studying. So those students are better at planning and regulating their learning and vice versa. So there's a couple of different kind of motivations here. The first one being extrinsic motivation. So this is kind of the idea of rewards. So in terms of school, that might be things like doing well in tests. It might be things like getting merits if you're lower, sort of for lower years, merits and stickers and stamps and things like that can be a really good way of motivating students. For A-level students, it's more to do with, getting an A, what do they need to get into university, have to be in school or attending lessons to get bursary, things like this. And that's kind of the extrinsic. And to improve metacognition, we can provide pupils with kind of a rationale for learning by sharing the bigger picture with them. So that might be sort of by continually explaining how their learning fits in with this bigger picture, like I've said. So with the course, the qualification, the careers that they might want to go into and successes in work and life. There were, positives and negatives to intrinsic motivation. And if you want to learn, want a bit more on this, I've got some additional reading that by all means, I'm happy to share with you. So if you go back to the beginning, we've got my email there. So it can produce quick changes in short term, quick changes short term behavior wise. But what we kind of need to do is think about how we can convert the extrinsic, so to develop this into the intrinsic. So then the intrinsic motivation is driven by, rather than anything external, like the external rewards they're reaping, it's more intrinsic. So by an inherent interest in or enjoyment in the task. And hopefully that comes with time. And it's kind of the self-desire to seek new things, new challenges in order to gain new knowledge. So intrinsic motivation, so for the EEFs, again, saying it's a natural motivational tendency and a critical element in cognitive, social and physical development. So the aim is to try and turn those kind of extrinsic rewards into intrinsic ones. So, it might begin with why students motivated might start off as this extrinsic reward, but then hopefully over time it becomes because of their enjoyment of the subject, and it's actually those intrinsic motivations that become long-lasting and self-sustaining. So it's things like improves their skills through metacognition and again self-regulation. So where possible, kind of engaging tasks that making it relatable to them wherever possible. So pupils are likely to be intrinsically motivated if they attribute their educational results to factors under their own control. So this is known as autonomy. So having some autonomy over their results and their factors affecting that. If they believe in their own ability to succeed in specific situations or to accomplish a task. So again, known as a sense of self-efficiency. And again, that can be encouraged. So encouraging students to see that they can succeed in a task themselves. And gradually, so you might be rewarding students for doing additional bits of research or whatever it might be. And then gradually it might just be something that students end up, the hope is that it's something that students will then end up doing because of this intrinsic motivation. And then finally, so they are genuinely interested in accomplishing something to a high level of proficiency, knowledge and skill, not just in achieving good grades, so known as mastery. So it's not just about getting an A, but it's about being, good at this subject. So again, it's about knowing your students, being able to relate learning to their wider life plans, trying to turning that extrinsic motivation into intrinsic. So rewards for additional tasks and research, which eventually students just end up doing because of the enjoyment they find there, or because it becomes part of their routine. Okay, so moving on then. So next point of metacognition, so thinking together. So you're guiding the pupil from being the novice to the expert. So this process is to ensure that pupils are increasingly independent over time. So it begins with lots of scaffolds in place, but slowly removing these scaffolds as pupils develop their knowledge and skills, asking challenging questions and guiding pupils with kind of verbal feedback. So involving maybe prompts and hints on online resources and kind of prompting dialogue. Oops. So again, EEF talks about this dialogic teaching and saying it's a particularly effective method of managing interaction. So it's emphasising classroom dialogue through which pupils learn to reason, discuss, argue, explain, and kind of thinking about how you might be able to do that within an online setting. So it's important that dialogue isn't just between the teacher and the student, but with the students themselves as well, so between each other. So a couple of ways that we could try that. So group work, I know isn't always easy, particularly if live lessons aren't happening, but if they are, breakout rooms can be brilliant. Jam boards can be fantastic. There are additional resources on these if you want a little bit more information about these ideas. Google Chat as well, or even working collaboratively on a Google Doc. There's a chat function at the side where students can share ideas. Questioning, so again, if you are using online lessons or Google Meet or whatever different software you're using, and sort of thinking about questioning and that kind of questioning, making sure it's, as we all know, the sort of opening questioning and encouraging conversation. But that can be something that's done as feedback as well. So on Google Docs, posing a question and getting students kind of reflecting on their learning. And flipped learning as well, so getting students to kind of think about things before coming into lesson or before or having an aspect of flipped learning. Sometimes thinking about before they answer a question, what could go wrong in answering that question, particularly useful in kind of exam questions or longer answer questions. As I've said there, so yeah, exam question techniques, what could go wrong? Okay, so if we've done all of these things, hopefully students are moving towards independence and autonomy. So feedback is very important as part of this to help them kind of plan, monitor and evaluate their process. So useful examples, so encouraging independent learning, and these are things you can kind of put in place with students. So setting short-term goals, and again, like I've said previously, so it's about knowing your students and knowing what would work well for them. If they need those short-term goals, putting them in place for them. Can they think of their own short-term goals? Adopting powerful strategies for attaining these goals, so not just what is your goal, but how are you going to get there? Some SMART targets, that kind of thing. Monitoring performance, restructuring the context, managing time efficiently. So I think that's where students need a lot of help. Is it spending too much time, not thinking efficiently? So spending hours trying to do something that could be done quite efficiently, and self-evaluating one's methods. So then there's a way to kind of sort of assess, I suppose assess isn't the right word, but gauge how much support students need. And there are these different kind of, I suppose, categories of students. So tacit learners are unaware of their metacognitive knowledge. So don't think about any particular strategies for learning. Merely accept if they know something or they don't know something. So there, obviously, you need to employ a lot more kind of strategies to support those students to get them up to the level of a reflective learner. You've then got your next level, so kind of the aware learners who recognise some of the thinking processes they use. However, thinking is not necessarily deliberate or planned. So kind of the next stage up. Then after that, strategic learners, so organise their thinking by using problem solving, grouping, classifying, evidence seeking, decision making, that kind of thing. They know and apply strategies that help them learn. And then finally are the reflective learners. So we're aiming to take the tacit, aware and strategic learners to the reflective learners. So not only strategic about their own thinking, but they also reflect upon their learning whilst it's happening. So considering the success or failure of their strategies and revising them as appropriate. So it's about making students aware of that, and how could you do that within lessons and in a kind of online context. Again, it's thinking about what's going to work in terms of, you know, where you're at in your school, how much online learning you are doing. Okay. If you do have any questions or want any additional resources, I do have a couple of bits of kind of further reading, which I can either email out or there's, you know, I think you can find this if you look online. So again, it's from the Educational Endowment Foundation. So it's about metacognition and self-regulated learning. So it's the kind of guidance report there. And then also some of where I got some of this motivation, so research-based strategies. If any of that you think you might be interested in, please do just drop me an email and I can send that out. Right, I will hand over to Lucy now.
Okay, so what I'm going to talk about now is I'm just going to quickly look at the resilience framework. I'm going to touch a little bit more on modelling. I know Rosie's mentioned that before, but I'll just go into a little bit more detail. And then we're going to look at generative learning. So understanding exactly how our students work, like Rosie said, has never been more important. And we really need to kind of close that gap and ensure that all students have the resilience strategies so they can be confident in their work and confident in their ability to work independently. Resilience is what enables children to emerge from challenging experiences with kind of a really positive sense about themselves and the future. And hopefully we can give our students, you know, those strategies to face disappointment better, learn from failure, and adapt to change, which is something that is obviously so kind of pertinent now when education's never been more different. So the resilience framework then, I'm only going to look at a few aspects of this. It's basically made up of 5 approaches. So looking at the basics, belonging, learning, coping, and core self. I'm going to look in a little bit more detail at the middle 3, so belonging, learning, and coping, and hopefully some strategies that we can relate to a classroom and also on remote learning. So belonging then, it's kind of really creating a sense of purpose for the student. We do that in the classroom, but how can we do it online? And we use Google Classroom, which is great for the chat feature, which is just on my screen at the moment. The students can kind of comment on there. It really creates a sense of community. You can see on the one that I've done, I've given some feedback to this one student, but actually other students have chipped in and kind of helped them out, just as they would if they were in a normal classroom setting. Looking at learning then, Rosie kind of mentioned this before, but we need to kind of create this classroom culture where failure, setbacks and disappointment are expected, and they're actually a part of learning. We need to hold students accountable for producing their own work, and so that they feel kind of ownership of that and they get those rewards. So it's kind of like establishing and reinforcing an atmosphere where students are praised for their hard work, but also praised for their perseverance and for their grit and for, you know, overcoming misconceptions and mistakes, not just for easy successes and the grade, like top grades that they're getting. If we're going to cultivate this culture in our classroom, then we need to teach students learning strategies to cope with setbacks and mistakes. So coping then, how do we teach those kind of coping strategies? A lovely way that I love to do this is to really encourage reflections. Students sometimes find it difficult to articulate their thoughts when they're completing a task, and asking them to do so when they are actually doing that task may interfere with the task itself. I found that personally, reflections are best taking place once a task or a lesson has completed. I found out the hard way that they do need a lot of support when they are completing reflections, capturing and kind of recording their successes, or you do end up with some quite meaningless reflections, such as I did good today. I found that kind of creating this slide here and showing that with some sentence starters, again, kind of suitable to the age and ability you are teaching. So this one was for a bottom set year 7 class. You can really kind of encourage resilience. You know, you can get them to think about, I didn't do so well today on this. However, next lesson I could improve by doing this. And it kind of really does kind of get that deeper thinking as well. Moving on to modelling then. Now Rosie did kind of look at quite a lot of modelling strategies, which are, you know, really, really good for teaching resilience to our students. You may be familiar or have read the book Rosenshine's Principles of Action, and it's full of really kind of clear and concise ways that we can engage with the world of cognitive science and how to kind of practically include it in your lessons. He does talk a lot about modelling and how exactly to complete tasks. We're giving out students the kind of self-regulatory skills that they need to complete work independently. So by working through a problem with students, modelling kind of the thinking, the decision making at all different points as you're going through it, students are kind of made aware of those thought processes that we go through in order to solve a problem. So one example is worked examples. So it's a form of modelling where a teacher may provide a step-by-step demonstration of how to perform a task. This one's actually taken from a product design lesson. Visualizers, like we mentioned before, are absolutely fantastic for this. You can project your screen up onto the board and you can kind of talk through all your different processes to give kind of a really example. I'm doing this because I'm thinking of this, and kind of really work through a task with the students. You then end up with what we call at Hathershaw a really good waggle. So what a good one looks like, the students can then use that to help them complete a task. There's another example here. My subject, this was a writing task on French. So we had the success criteria, and then together we kind of came up with this little piece of writing. We looked at the success criteria, we kind of color coded it all and talked through the different ways that we would approach this task. And again, the students had that waggle at the end to help them with their own work. We did talk about thinking aloud before, which is a kind of what it says on the tin. You think aloud, you kind of narrate your decisions. And by doing this, narrating these decisions, these choices that we make when we are attempting a task. For example, where to begin when writing an essay, or where to start when attempting a maths problem. We're teaching the students how to be resilient. It's not just, I can't do that. It's, hang on, what strategies do I need in order to be able to do that? It helps students to learn to monitor their thinking as they read, and it also improves their comprehension. So model your thinking as you are reading. It could be reading out a text, it could be just reading out a question. And then do this at points when that might be confusing for the students. So for example, if there's new vocabulary in there, or if there's unusual sentence construction. What I found good as well is sharing a set of questions with students. Again, you can model how to use this strategy effectively, and it kind of really does give them that support of what they should be thinking about and what questions they should be thinking of. Hopefully, students start this by thinking aloud with the teacher and thinking aloud with classmates, but then finally this should internalize that dialogue and kind of really direct their own problem solving processes. So generative learning then, and how can generative learning help students to develop resilience? If we want children to learn and remember, we need to get them to select information, organize it, and then attach it to a context that they can understand and integrate it into those schemas that Rosie mentioned before in order for it to be effective. So generative learning suggests that the learning process is based on memory that's already stored in our brains. So making sense of new information by mentally reorganizing it and integrating it with prior knowledge. Basically, it's connecting the dots in an intuitive way. That's the kind of core of generative learning. It does build very much on what Rosie talks about and goes hand in hand with metacognition. So as mentioned before, metacognition involves the awareness and the control of your cognitive processes. So for example, knowing which information to select, what kind of structure to build, and what kind of prior knowledge to activate. And then generative learning is the ability to evaluate your own understanding in the material and then select different learning strategies. So it's not just drawing on prior knowledge, it's kind of going that one step further and being able to generate learning strategies to help you. Generative learning is based on strategies given in a book. It's called Generative Activity, 8 Learning Strategies that Promote Learning by Logan Fiorella and Richard Mayer. It's slightly dated now, but really, really useful. And it's quite easy to adapt those strategies to online learning and remote learning. There is a fantastic book that came out earlier this year, written by Zoe and Mark Enser. It's called Flipping the Coin, Generative Learning in Action. The flipping the coin that they talk about in the title kind of refers to Rosenshine's theories that I did mention before. Obviously, they're great for modelling, questioning and recapping. And basically, in this book by Zoe and Mark Enser, they have a chapter on each of Fiorella and Mayer's learning strategies with loads of ideas in each one about how you can actually implement these into the classroom. Their thoughts when they were writing this book are, okay, so Rosenshine has told us all about impactful modelling, questioning, recapping, and how important they are in a classroom. But what about the parts of the lesson where the student's actually doing something, when they are independently working? This is where the generative learning strategies come in. They say once we've delivered our instruction to students, we want to ensure that they generate new ideas and strategies that can be stored in their long-term memory. So it revolves around this SOI model, this selecting, organising and integrating. Students are prompted to select information from a teaching sequence, organise it, and then finally integrate it into their schema on this topic. The strategies themselves that I'm going to talk about, you'll be really familiar with them. So we've got summarising, mapping, drawing, imagining, self-testing, self-explaining, teaching and enacting. These strategies also provide opportunities to develop metacognitive processes and build towards a student who's self-sufficient, a student who is independent, and that keyword that we keep going on about, resilient. Part of generative learning is about teaching our pupils how to deploy these strategies themselves in order to learn from new information. So what does generative learning actually look like in action? I'm not going to go through all 8 strategies. As I said, they're things that you will be very, very familiar with. And I could be here for a very long time, but I will focus on 3 of those. And like Rosie mentioned before, hopefully we can give you some ideas of how to implement this into your classroom, whether that's in person or online, and you can go away from this webinar with some things to try yourselves. So I'm going to focus on summarising, self-explaining and self-testing, as I feel like these 3 kind of really lend themselves to remote learning and encourage those metacognitive skills even more. So summarising then, now it really does depend on the age of the students you teach as to how best to kind of implement this strategy. It works best for relatively simple ideas or concepts and things that aren't too complicated. So when we ask students to interpret main ideas into their own words, it helps them to understand assess their own level of comprehension and their own understanding. It does require effective modelling. So you might want to, for example, if we are asking students to summarise each paragraph in a text, you might want to give them some headings and ask them which one would go with each paragraph, kind of really scaffold that, or getting them, like I said, getting them to think of their own title maybe for each paragraph rather than summarising the whole text, just break it down slightly. One thing that we do quite a lot at Hathershaw is once students have read a text is get them to summarise it into a tweet or a Facebook post with maybe a certain number of words. You might find that for your students, summarising into a picture may work best. And the other example I've got on the screen at the moment is from Jamboard. For those who aren't familiar with Jamboard, it's an add-on that's designed by Google, so it works perfectly with Google Classroom. It's a bit like a virtual whiteboard. Students can draw, write, add sticky notes, and that can all be done live or whilst you've got an assignment up there. This one, for example, I've put headings at the top and I've asked students to categorise bits from the text under these specific headings. Self-explanation then, so kind of building on that idea of summarising is the idea of self-explanation. It comes in so many different forms and we really, really want to teach students how to regulate their learning, which kind of involves clarifying information as they are going along and as they are learning. You can do this through questioning. That works really well in the classroom, always asking students why. So how did you come to this conclusion? Can you explain your working out? Even getting them to ask kind of their peers questions and probing kind of deeper into that explanation. We really need to model this again for students to be able to ask relevant questions. So maybe having a bank of questions that they can ask each other rather than you just asking all the time. Every time a student gives an answer, I'd always be asking, explain your thought process. How did you get there? Talk us through exactly how you have got to that answer. You can also use students' answers to model. So sometimes you get that absolutely kind of one brilliant, blow your mind answer and you give kind of loads of praise for that, whereas other students in the class might not understand exactly why that student's getting all the praise. They might be, the depth kind of might be lost on them. So live writing an answer on the board, again, using Jamboard to kind of live write an answer, or a shared Google Documents, and annotating it, deconstructing it. It kind of helps the rest of the class see how that conclusion was made. Highlight the thinking in the answer, highlight the structure, highlight the vocabulary, and then show the students, just like, you know, when we were talking about modelling, how they can end up at the same outcome. What I've got on my slide at the moment, you may be familiar with. It's the ABC questioning technique. So a really good way of turning the process of kind of questions and answers into a whole class dialogue, encouraging students to further explain their answers. So once one student has given their answer, another student must either agree with this, and then another student will build on their answer, and another student will then challenge their answer. So it takes away from kind of teacher directed questions, and it really develops that resilience in students, encouraging really kind of deep thinking on their part. And it also encourages independence, which is obviously crucial at the moment, especially. A lot of the students, when they're at home, are expected to complete independent work. It also helps students see different viewpoints as well. You can model this really effectively by providing sentence starters. That's what I've got on my slide at the minute. So somebody gives a new opinion, I agree with this because, the reason I agree with this is, and then somebody else would build on that. This is a good answer, however, you could also include, and then the third person would challenge that. My own view is slightly different because I'd like to challenge this idea because, and it kind of just really creates a nice dialogue there within the class. You can also play games to develop self-explanation. So for example, one of the games I love to play is I'm thinking of something, where the students have to kind of summarize that keyword and give a description of that keyword without actually saying what it is. So they need to really think about a detailed kind of explanation of that, so that somebody else can guess what they are talking about. Self-testing then, many different titles for this. Retrieval-based learning, recall, involves basically answering practice questions about previously learned material, which of course strengthens connections between all that previously learned information. The great thing about self-testing is that students can make use of all these brilliant apps and quiz websites that are about the minute. So we regularly use Kahoot, Quizlet and Google Quizzes. It really kind of engages the students. Gamification is brilliant when you include it into your lessons. On Google Quizzes, so you can create a quiz through Google Forms. You can do it as the teacher, but you can also set the permissions, so each student could add in a question. Evidence shows as well that self-testing works best when it's paired with immediate feedback, and Google Quizzes is perfect for that, because you can actually put in, if the students select a wrong answer, some feedback will appear straight away, and you know that's automatic, and you can address misconceptions straight away. It's great self-testing for students to develop their resilience, become aware of their own learning. It does need modelling, and personally I feel that some of my students aren't at that point yet, that they will self-test on their own accord. So setting these quizzes with a time limit, creating competition, so the Kahoot one on the right hand side, they can play that quiz will be there for a week, and they can kind of go at it as many times as they want and try and get to the top of the class leaderboard. Quizlet Live as well, they get paired in teams to answer all the questions, and that kind of really does engage them as well. Overall, it doesn't require explicit training to do self-testing, but students do need to be taught the value of practicing these tests again and again as a learning strategy. Repeated practice testing is obviously really, really important. The last thing I want to talk about today is just managing expectations. We have obviously expectations for our classroom when we're face to face, and it's really, really important that these transfer to online learning, and we have expectations for all the different strategies that we've discussed. Students can be, can develop these resilience skills and, all the different things that we've talked about, modeling, all the generative learning strategies, done well, modeled well, and kind of set out with specific expectations of exactly how you want the students to complete these tasks can have a massive change, and it can kind of bridge that gap between the students that are in school, the students that are at home, and kind of the lost learning that's happened. So that is it for today from us. Both our email addresses are on the front of the webinar, so please, if there's any more information or if there's any questions that you have, please send us an email. We've got loads of different webinars coming up on a huge range of topics, so please have a look at our OSFC EdTech demonstrator website, and if there's any that you would like to join, you can sign up for those on there. Thanks very much for listening, and we look forward to hearing any questions you might have. Thank you.